The Hells Angels biker followed the little girl's screams into a diesel bay, and his strike split the steel silence. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The cold wind sliced through the night as a thick layer of fog settled over the industrial district. The screeching of metal against metal echoed in the distance, a harsh, unrelenting sound. A faint cry broke through the eerie silence, a sound that no one else seemed to notice. But for Jake Reaper Morrison, it was as clear as day. He slowed his Harley-Davidson as the wind howled in his face. His weathered eyes narrowed as he scanned the area, his instincts honed over years of riding with the Hells Angels kicking in. The scream came again, louder this time, filled with raw desperation. It was the kind of cry that froze the blood. It was a sound that demanded attention. Without thinking, Jake veered his bike toward the source, the engine roaring beneath him as he cut through the fog. The industrial park was a maze of abandoned warehouses and forgotten diesel bays, their steel doors rusting in the cold. The air smelled of gasoline and old oil, the kind of place where no one would expect a cry for help. He parked his bike behind a steel bay, the engine rumbling to a stop. He dismounted, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the sound. His leather jacket creaked with each step, his patch glinting in the dim light. He reached the corner of the bay and saw her, a little girl, no older than 8, sitting on the cold concrete, tears streaming down her face. She was shaking, her small body curled into itself for warmth and protection. She had been crying, her voice hoarse, but she froze when she saw Jake. Her wide eyes darted up to meet his, fear evident in every inch of her fragile form. She was alone, no one in sight to help her, trapped in the dark. Jake felt a familiar pang of guilt, but he quickly suppressed it. He wasn't here for sentiment. He was here to make sure she was safe. Hey, are you okay? Jake's voice was low, gruff, the sound of a man who'd seen too much. His hands were rough, scarred from years of life on the road, but he moved slowly, carefully, so as not to frighten her. The little girl stared at him, her small frame trembling as she instinctively backed away. She could feel the power radiating from him, the fearsome presence of a man who belonged to the Hells Angels, a man who had fought countless battles. But something in his eyes softened. Don't be scared. I'm not here to hurt you, Jake said, his voice gentler than he expected. The girl didn't move at first, but after a few long seconds, she finally spoke. They took my brother, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. I tried to stop them, but I couldn't. Jake's heart sank as he knelt beside her, his large frame looming over her. He knew the streets well enough to understand what she was saying. They weren't just bullies. These were dangerous people, the kind that didn't hesitate to hurt children. Where did they go? Jake asked, keeping his voice calm, his fingers brushing through his beard as he studied her closely. She pointed shakily toward the shadows, a hint of fear in her eyes. Back there. They dragged him into the warehouse. Jake's jaw clenched. He could feel the adrenaline building up inside him. He had no idea what he was about to walk into, but one thing was for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt this kid. Stay here, Jake said. I'm going in. As he turned to face the darkened warehouse, a flash of pain crossed the girl's face, her small voice barely rising above the wind. Please, don't leave me. Jake paused. He glanced back at her, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He hadn't realized how deeply her fear had taken root. It wasn't just fear of the men who had taken her brother. It was the fear of being alone, abandoned in the cold. Jake hesitated for a moment longer, then walked back to her, kneeling down once more. I'm not going anywhere, he said, his voice rough but reassuring. We're going to get your brother back. Without another word, Jake pulled his phone from his jacket, sending a quick message to his brothers in the club, summoning them. The girl clutched his sleeve, her tiny hand trembling. Jake stood up, his mind already focused on what needed to be done. This wasn't just about saving her brother. It was about making sure no one ever had to face the kind of fear she had endured ever again. He would make sure of that. As the sound of approaching engines echoed in the distance, Jake set his jaw, preparing for what was coming next. The cold night air was thick with tension as Jake's boots hit the gravel, crunching with every step as he moved toward the warehouse. The little girl's trembling hand had left an imprint on his sleeve, a silent plea that echoed in his mind. Her brother was still inside, probably scared out of his mind, and Jake wasn't about to let anyone harm him. As the sound of his brother's bikes grew louder, Jake glanced back to see the familiar shapes of his fellow Hell's Angels riders, closing in. His heart thudded harder in his chest. This was it. The moment where everything could either go right or go terribly wrong. Jake reached the door of the warehouse and glanced over his shoulder one last time to check on the girl. She was still sitting there, looking so small and fragile in the shadows. She nodded once at him, and he knew she was trusting him to bring her brother back. Without a word, Jake turned the handle and pushed the door open, the old metal screeching on its hinges. Inside, the dim light from a single bulb hung overhead, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The air smelled stale, full of oil and rust. The silence was thick, broken only by the sound of Jake's boots as he walked in, every step deliberate and calculated. He scanned the room, looking for any sign of movement. The smell of diesel lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of fear. The warehouse was eerily quiet, too quiet. It was like the calm before a storm, and Jake knew it wasn't going to stay calm for long. As he moved further into the space, his eyes landed on the small figure in the corner. It was her brother. He was tied to a post, his face bruised and bloodied. Jake's stomach turned, but he kept his face impassive, his hand tightening around the handle of the knife hidden in his boot. He wasn't about to let this go down like the last time. Not again. He crept closer, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. He didn't see anyone at first, but he knew they were there. They always were. A voice broke the silence. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," a man said from the shadows. Jake froze, his grip tightening around the knife. He didn't need to turn to know the voice. It was the same one that had haunted his past, the same one that had made him leave everything behind. The leader of the gang that had been after him for years. Jake's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. "Let the kid go," Jake growled, his voice low and steady. "He hasn't done anything to you." The man stepped out of the shadows, his face just as familiar as the voice. A scar ran across his cheek, and his eyes gleamed with malice. "You always were the hero, Reaper. But you're too late. This kid's gonna pay for your mistakes." The words hung in the air like a thick fog, but Jake didn't back down. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on the man. "I don't care what you think. Let him go now, or you'll regret it." The man laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that made the hair on the back of Jake's neck stand up. "You think you can scare me, biker? You're nothing. You were nothing when you joined the Hell's Angels, and you're nothing now. I've got all the power here." Jake didn't waste any time on words. He lunged forward, his knife flashing in the dim light, cutting through the air. The man barely had time to react before Jake's blade sank into his side. He gasped, stumbling back as the blood spilled from the wound. Jake didn't let up, his eyes burning with anger as the man crumpled to the ground. The silence in the warehouse was broken only by the sound of his heavy breathing. For a moment, everything felt still. But Jake knew it wasn't over. The gang wouldn't just let him walk away. He turned toward the kid, who was now staring at him with wide, fearful eyes. "Are you okay?" Jake asked, his voice softening as he approached the boy. The kid nodded weakly, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I thought I was going to die." Jake's heart clenched at the sight. No child should ever have to face that kind of fear. He crouched down in front of him, cutting the ropes that bound his wrists. "You're safe now. I'm getting you out of here." But before Jake could lift him up, the sound of more motorcycles roared through the air. Jake knew it was the rest of the gang. They were here, and they weren't going to let him leave without a fight. His mind raced as he lifted the kid into his arms, his eyes scanning for a way out. The gang was closing in, but Jake wasn't about to let them take him down. He wasn't going to lose another innocent life. The moment the door to the warehouse burst open, Jake bolted for the exit, his boots slamming against the floor as he carried the kid to safety. The cold night air hit his face as he ran, the sounds of the gang's motorcycles echoing behind him. He could hear their shouts, their engines roaring, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. He had to get the kid to safety, no matter what it took. The cold wind stung his face, but Jake didn't feel it. All that mattered was the kid in his arms, the promise he'd made to protect him. They ran through the darkness, their footsteps the only sound in the still night. It felt like an eternity, but finally, they reached the safety of the alley. Jake ducked into the shadows, glancing over his shoulder to make sure they weren't being followed. When he was certain they were safe, he gently set the kid down. "You're gonna be okay," Jake said, his voice reassuring. "I won't let them hurt you." As the kid looked up at him, Jake felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something good. He wasn't just the Reaper anymore. He was a protector, and that made all the difference. The cold night air pressed against Jake's skin as he looked over the boy, who was now breathing heavily but seemed to be recovering. The boy clung to his leather jacket, his small hands shaking from the trauma. Jake couldn't stop himself from scanning the dark alley, every shadow feeling like a potential threat. His instincts were on high alert. The sound of distant engines still roared through the night. The gang wasn't far behind. But for the first time, Jake wasn't sure if he was prepared to face them head-on. He looked down at the kid, the fear in his eyes starting to fade, replaced by a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was all Jake needed to move forward. He adjusted his grip on the boy and straightened his posture. They were safe for now, but they couldn't stay in this alley forever. He needed to get him out of here, somewhere hidden, somewhere the gang wouldn't find them. "We need to go," Jake said in a low voice, his words filled with urgency. The boy nodded, his small legs wobbling as he tried to stand. Jake helped him, his large hands steadying him, guiding him through the shadows. They moved quickly, but Jake could feel the weight of the boy's trust with every step they took. The streets seemed deserted, but Jake knew better than to think they were alone. He led the boy down another alley, the familiar hum of city lights flickering in the distance. He stopped at a small, nondescript door, tucked away behind a rusted fence. This was his place. It wasn't much, just a small storage unit he had turned into a safe space. But it was his sanctuary from the chaos of the world. Jake unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping inside. The boy followed, his eyes wide as he took in the small, dimly lit space. It was barely furnished, just a bed in the corner, some tools scattered about, and a few old motorcycle parts stacked in piles. "You can sit here," Jake said, motioning to the bed. "I'll get you something warm." The boy hesitated for a moment before sitting down, his body still trembling. Jake pulled off his jacket and draped it over the kid's shoulders, feeling a strange mix of protectiveness and guilt. He had made a promise to this boy, a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Jake moved to the small kitchenette in the corner, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. He returned to the boy, handing it to him. The boy took it eagerly, drinking deeply. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake sat across from him, his eyes scanning the boy's face. There was something in his expression, something beyond the fear that had clouded it earlier. Jake could see the strength that was starting to emerge, even in the face of everything that had happened to him. "What's your name?" Jake asked, his voice softer than usual. "Ethan," the boy replied, his voice shaking slightly. And my sister, Emma. She's waiting for me." Jake nodded. He could feel the weight of the boy's words. Emma, the girl who had cried out for help. She was still out there, waiting for her brother. Jake couldn't leave her behind. He knew the kid had been through a lot, but he couldn't walk away from that promise. He glanced toward the door, his mind racing with plans. "I'm going to get you to her, Ethan," Jake said, his voice steady. "But we need to wait. We need to make sure the coast is clear. Those guys won't stop until they've found you both." Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. Jake could see it. He could see how much the boy depended on him, and it fueled his resolve. He wasn't about to let anyone hurt them. As the night stretched on, Jake kept watch. His eyes never left the window, his ears alert to the faintest sound. The hours seemed to drag, the weight of every passing minute heavy on his shoulders. But as dawn approached, he felt a shift in the air, a sense of calm that had been absent since he'd first heard the boy scream. Jake stood up, his muscles tense as he moved toward the door. Ethan looked up at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Stay here," Jake ordered softly, his voice low. "I'm going to make sure it's safe." Jake stepped outside, the early morning air biting at his skin. The streets were empty, and the sound of the city waking up filled the silence. He moved carefully, keeping to the shadows, his senses heightened. He checked every corner, every alley, before finally feeling certain that the gang had moved on. With a sigh of relief, Jake returned to the storage unit, his eyes finding Ethan's immediately. "It's time," Jake said, his voice steady. Ethan stood up, his legs still shaky, but determined. "Let's go," he said, his voice stronger now. Jake nodded, and together, they walked out into the early morning light. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he wasn't walking it alone. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint orange glow over the desolate streets of the city. Jake and Ethan had been walking for hours, the silence between them thick with the weight of their situation. Ethan's steps were slow, his body still adjusting to the shock of everything that had happened. But he kept moving, his determination not to let his sister down shining through. Jake had promised to get him back to Emma, and that promise was one he wasn't going to break. They walked through the back alleys, avoiding the main streets where they might be seen, the sound of their footsteps the only noise that filled the air. Jake's mind was constantly on alert, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. The gang was still out there, and they weren't going to stop until they found the boy. As they rounded another corner, Jake stopped, his hand instinctively going to his jacket, where his knife was always within reach. He scanned the street ahead, his senses tingling with the familiar feeling of being watched. "Stay close," he murmured to Ethan, his voice low but firm. Ethan nodded, his small hand gripping Jake's sleeve as they continued. The air was colder now, the quiet of the early morning settling over the city. It felt different. Something about the stillness made Jake uneasy. He had been through enough battles to know when something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he heard the faint sound of engines in the distance. "They're here," Jake muttered under his breath. Ethan looked up at him, fear creeping back into his eyes. "What do we do?" Jake didn't answer at first. He needed to think, needed a plan. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. He looked around, his eyes landing on a building in the distance. It was an old warehouse, abandoned and unused. It could offer the cover they needed. "We're heading for that warehouse," Jake said, his voice steady. "Stay close, don't make a sound." They picked up the pace, moving quickly but quietly through the narrow alleyways, trying to avoid the main roads where the gang might be searching. The sound of motorcycles grew louder, echoing through the streets like a storm rolling in. Jake's heart raced. He knew they were close, and the thought of facing down the gang again filled him with a mixture of dread and anger. He wasn't about to let them take Ethan or Emma. As they neared the warehouse, Jake looked over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. The motorcycles were getting closer, the rumble of their engines vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. They had to move faster. He reached for the door of the warehouse, his fingers grazing the cold metal. He twisted the handle, but it wouldn't budge. His mind raced. They couldn't afford to waste any time. "Get down," Jake hissed, pulling Ethan down behind a stack of crates. The boy obeyed, his small frame pressing against the cold ground. Jake's eyes darted around, searching for another way in. He couldn't let them be trapped. Then he spotted it, an old fire escape ladder, rusted but still intact. Without a second thought, Jake grabbed Ethan and pulled him toward it. "Climb," Jake ordered. "Now." Ethan hesitated for a moment, his hands shaking, but then he nodded and began to climb, Jake right behind him. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, closer. The gang was almost on them. As Ethan reached the top of the fire escape, Jake pulled himself up after him, his heart pounding in his chest. They were almost there. They had to make it inside before the gang found them. Just as Jake reached the top, a motorcycle screeched to a halt below. He froze, his hand on the ladder, his breath catching in his throat. He could hear the voices now, the familiar harsh tones of the gang members as they scanned the area. "They were here," one of them shouted. "Where'd they go?" Jake glanced at Ethan, who was crouched low, his eyes wide with fear. Jake reached for his knife, his fingers brushing against the cool metal. "We need to move." "Stay quiet," he whispered. Together, they moved toward the roof, each step calculated. Careful. Jake's mind was running a mile a minute. He had to keep them safe. They couldn't afford to be seen. As they reached the roof's edge, Jake spotted another building across the way, a few blocks over. It was a long jump, but it was their only shot. He looked at Ethan, meeting his gaze. "You ready?" Jake asked. Ethan nodded, determination in his eyes. Without wasting another second, Jake grabbed the boy's hand and ran. The leap was risky, but it was their only chance. They made it, landing hard on the rooftop of the neighboring building. Jake rolled, protecting Ethan as they hit the ground. "Keep going," Jake said, pulling Ethan to his feet. They didn't stop to look back. They couldn't. The gang would be searching, and they didn't have much time. They ran through the maze of rooftops. The city sprawled out beneath them. With every step, Jake's mind raced, calculating their next move. He wouldn't stop until Ethan and Emma were safe. Not again. They reached the end of the line. Another alleyway, this one leading to a street that wasn't as heavily trafficked. Jake glanced at Ethan. "We're almost there." But as they moved down the alley, the sound of engines once again filled the air. Jake stopped, his heart sinking. They weren't alone anymore. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the sound of motorcycles roared closer, the engines cutting through the early morning stillness. The alleyway was narrow, dark, and confined, offering little room for escape. He pulled Ethan behind him, his instincts kicking into overdrive. They had no time to waste. Jake glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the glint of headlights cutting through the gloom. The gang was closing in, and they weren't going to stop until they had the boy. The heavy sound of tires rolling over the pavement echoed, growing louder with every passing second. Jake's mind raced. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He couldn't risk getting caught in the open. They needed cover. The alley opened up into another street, but it was a dead end. An old, abandoned building sat there, its cracked windows staring back like hollow eyes. Without a word, Jake grabbed Ethan by the arm and pulled him toward the building. "Stay low, stay quiet," he whispered urgently. Ethan nodded, his face pale, but determined. Together, they crept toward the entrance, careful to avoid the light that filtered from the street. Jake's fingers wrapped around the rusty door handle, and with a quick glance to make sure no one was watching, he pushed it open. The door creaked, but it was a small sound compared to the thunder of engines behind them. They slipped inside, the cool, musty air greeting them like an old friend. The building was empty, save for piles of debris and old furniture. It was dark, the only light coming from the slivers of daylight that broke through the broken windows. Jake took a deep breath and motioned for Ethan to follow him. They moved quickly, each step calculated, as they made their way through the dim interior. Jake's eyes darted around, scanning for any way out. They couldn't stay here long. They wouldn't be safe in this place for much longer. Ethan tugged at his sleeve, his voice barely audible. "What if they find us?" Jake looked down at the boy, his face softening. "They won't. Not if we stay quiet and stick to the shadows." But Jake knew the odds were against them. The gang wouldn't stop, and they weren't going to give up easily. The sound of the motorcycles grew louder, almost deafening now. The gang was close, but they weren't inside yet. Jake's mind raced. He had to make sure they didn't get trapped in here. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on a set of stairs leading up to the second floor. It was a tight fit, but it was their best chance. Without hesitation, Jake pulled Ethan toward the stairs. "Come on," he urged, his voice low but firm. They ascended the stairs quickly, the old wood creaking under their weight. The second floor was a maze of empty rooms, most of them abandoned for years. They found a small corner in one of the rooms and crouched down, trying to make themselves as small as possible. Jake's heart was racing, his senses on high alert. He couldn't stop thinking about Emma, about getting Ethan back to her. He promised her he would protect him. He would keep that promise. The sound of the motorcycles outside stopped. Jake held his breath, listening intently. Then, the door to the building creaked open. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hallway, getting closer with every passing second. Jake's grip tightened on the knife hidden in his boot. He wasn't going down without a fight. He peeked through the crack in the door, his eyes narrowing as he saw two figures moving through the dark. They were looking for him. Jake could see the familiar Hell's Angels patches on their vests. They had found him. But Jake wasn't ready to be caught. He turned to Ethan, his eyes locking onto the boy's wide, fearful gaze. "Listen to me," Jake said, his voice urgent. "Stay here, stay quiet, and don't move no matter what." Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with fear but also trust. Jake could see it in the boy's eyes. Ethan believed in him. Jake stepped toward the door, his boots light on the floor. He had one shot at this. He pulled the knife from his boot, his knuckles white from the pressure. He could hear the men's voices now, the muffled sound of their conversation. They were getting closer, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they reached him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He wasn't afraid of them. He had faced worse. He waited for the right moment, his muscles tensed, ready to strike. The door to the room creaked open, and Jake sprang into action. He slammed into the first man, knocking him off balance. The second man barely had time to react before Jake's knife found its mark, sinking into his side. The man gasped, stumbling back as Jake moved swiftly, taking him down with one swift motion. The first man struggled to get up, but Jake was already on him, his knee pinning him to the floor as he pressed the blade to his throat. "You're done," Jake growled. The man's eyes widened in fear, but Jake wasn't finished yet. "Tell your boys to stay away," he said, his voice cold and menacing. The man nodded, his face paling as Jake released him. He scrambled to his feet, backing away slowly. "We're done here," Jake said, his voice low. "Get out of my sight." The man didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, disappearing into the night. Jake watched him go, his heart still pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if the gang was done, but he knew they had bought themselves some time. Ethan was safe, for now. Jake turned to the boy, his face softening as he approached. "We're not out of this yet," Jake said, his voice still low. "But we've got a chance. Let's get you to Emma." The streets were eerily quiet as Jake and Ethan moved through the shadows, their footsteps muffled by the soft hum of the early morning. The tension was thick in the air. Each breath Jake took felt heavy, weighed down by the uncertainty of what was ahead. He had gotten Ethan out of danger for now, but the truth was, they were still deep in it. The gang was far from done, and Jake wasn't naive enough to believe they wouldn't come looking for revenge. He glanced over at Ethan, the boy walking close beside him, his small frame huddled in the oversized jacket Jake had given him. Ethan looked up at him, his wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and trust. Jake didn't want to break that trust, not now. He had to get Ethan to Emma, no matter what it took. "We're almost there," Jake muttered, his voice steady despite the knot of anxiety twisting in his stomach. Ethan nodded, but Jake could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't a kid anymore. He understood how dangerous their situation was. They kept moving, ducking into alleyways and staying out of sight, each step bringing them closer to Emma. The first few blocks passed without incident, the city waking up around them. But Jake knew that was all it was, an illusion of safety. He felt the weight of the Hell's Angels patch on his back, a reminder that they weren't the only ones who knew how to fight dirty. The low rumble of an engine broke the silence, and Jake immediately froze. His muscles tensed as he turned his head, scanning the street ahead. The sound grew louder, unmistakable. A motorcycle. He couldn't see it yet, but he could feel it coming. "Stay close," Jake whispered, his hand pulling Ethan in tighter. He wanted to run, but he knew the chances of outrunning a gang of bikers on motorcycles were slim to none. They needed to find cover. Fast. Jake's eyes darted around, landing on a small alleyway up ahead, just wide enough for them to slip into without being seen. They moved quickly, adrenaline surging through Jake's veins as they pressed against the cold brick wall, the sound of the motorcycle growing louder by the second. As they ducked into the alley, Jake could hear the engine cut off, followed by the distinct sound of boots hitting the pavement. The gang was close. He turned to Ethan, his face stern. "Don't make a sound," he said. The boy nodded, his small hands clutching the fabric of Jake's jacket. Jake held his breath, listening to the footsteps echo through the alley, the gang members searching the area. They had to be close. His fingers tightened around the handle of his knife, the weight of it a small comfort. He wasn't going to let them take Ethan, not now. The footsteps paused just a few feet away, and Jake could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure how much longer they could stay hidden. Then, the sound of a voice cut through the tension. "They can't have gone far. Split up and search the streets." The command sent a chill down Jake's spine. They were splitting up, covering more ground. That meant they would have to be extra careful. The man's voice grew quieter as he moved farther away, and Jake knew they had their chance. He grabbed Ethan's hand and pulled him deeper into the alley, moving as quietly as possible. The last thing they needed was to run into one of the gang members face to face. They reached the end of the alley, and Jake's eyes scanned the street beyond. It was a dead end, but there was a narrow passage between two buildings that led to a quieter part of the neighborhood. They could make it there, but they had to move fast. Jake took one last glance back down the alley, but the gang members were still out of sight. "Come on," he urged, pulling Ethan forward. They moved swiftly through the passage, the quiet streets offering no refuge. But they were closer now. The sound of the motorcycles had faded, but Jake could still feel the weight of their presence hanging over them. The street ahead was quieter, lined with rows of old houses that had seen better days. The neighborhood was calm, but Jake knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. They couldn't keep running forever. As they rounded the corner, the distant sound of engines revving echoed once again, and Jake's stomach dropped. This time, there was no mistaking it. They were coming for them. The boy looked up at him, fear in his eyes. "What do we do now?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jake didn't have an answer. They couldn't outrun them, and they couldn't hide forever. But he wasn't about to let Ethan down. "We fight," Jake said, his voice steady, filled with resolve. He pulled Ethan closer, making sure the boy was protected behind him. They had to make their stand. They had come too far to back down now. The gang was closing in, but Jake wasn't going to let them take anything else. Not now. Not after everything they'd been through. The engines roared closer, and Jake took a deep breath, ready to face whatever came next. The engines roared closer, a deep rumbling sound that echoed off the buildings and vibrated through the pavement. Jake's grip tightened on the boy's hand, his heart racing in his chest. They were cornered now, the street ahead blocked by a wall of steel. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It was just them and the gang. Jake felt the weight of the moment, the realization that everything had led to this. They had come too far to back down. The boy, Ethan, was still behind him, his small hand gripping Jake's sleeve tightly. He could feel the fear radiating off the kid, but there was something else there, too. It was a kind of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, Jake could get them out of this alive. "Stay close," Jake whispered, his voice low but firm. He wasn't sure if it was for the boy's benefit or his own. The motorcycles grew louder, their engines revving as they approached. There were at least 4 of them, maybe more. Jake didn't know how many riders there were, but he wasn't about to let them get the upper hand. He turned to Ethan, his face hardening. "When I say run, you run as fast as you can. Don't look back. You hear me?" Ethan nodded, his face pale, but he held Jake's gaze. "I hear you." Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. He didn't want to fight. Not like this. But there was no other choice. He had to protect the boy. He had to protect Emma. The sound of the engines reached a crescendo as the gang pulled into view. 4 men, all clad in black leather, their patches gleaming in the dim light. Jake could see the anger in their eyes as they spotted him. The leader of the group, a large man with a scar running across his cheek, revved his engine, his eyes locking onto Jake's. "You think you can run from us, Reaper?" he shouted, his voice carrying over the roar of the engines. Jake didn't flinch. He stepped forward, placing himself between the gang and Ethan. "I'm not running from anyone," Jake said, his voice steady, though he could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins. The leader grinned, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You should have stayed gone, Reaper. Now you've got a choice. You can walk away, or we can make you walk." Jake's eyes narrowed. He wasn't afraid of them. He had faced worse. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Ethan. About Emma. "I'm not going anywhere," Jake said, his voice low and full of resolve. The leader's smile faltered, and without warning, he revved his engine and charged. Jake reacted instinctively, his body moving before his mind could catch up. He grabbed Ethan by the arm and yanked him out of the way, just as the motorcycle barreled past. The force of it nearly knocked them off their feet, but Jake held on tight. The leader swung around, coming back for another pass. Jake quickly assessed the situation, his mind calculating their chances. He didn't have much time. The others were closing in, their bikes moving faster now. He needed to make a move, and fast. "Run!" Jake shouted, pushing Ethan toward the alley. "Go now." Ethan hesitated for a split second, fear flashing across his face, but then he ran. Jake stayed behind, watching as the boy sprinted toward the alleyway. His heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment. Jake turned to face the approaching riders, the sound of their engines deafening. He had no choice but to fight. The first rider came at him fast, but Jake was ready. He stepped to the side, just in time to avoid the motorcycle as it passed. He lunged forward, grabbing the rider's arm and yanking him off the bike. The The man hit the pavement hard, but Jake didn't give him a chance to recover. He pressed his knee into the man's chest, holding him down. "You're not going anywhere," Jake growled, his voice cold. The second rider tried to circle back, but Jake was faster. He grabbed the bike by the handlebar and swung it around, sending the rider tumbling into a nearby trash bin. The gang wasn't backing down, but Jake wasn't going to let them take him or Ethan. He turned to see the leader coming at him again, this time with a weapon, a crowbar. Jake didn't hesitate. He dodged the first swing, stepping to the side and using the momentum to knock the crowbar out of the man's hand. The leader staggered back, but Jake was already on him. He punched the man in the stomach, forcing the air out of his lungs, then threw him to the ground. "You're done," Jake said, breathing heavily. The gang was falling apart, but Jake wasn't done yet. He turned back to see if Ethan was safe. The boy had made it into the alley, but Jake knew they still weren't out of the woods. The remaining riders were getting back on their bikes, their faces filled with rage. But they didn't come after him. Not yet. "Go," Jake shouted to Ethan, urging him to keep running. Ethan didn't hesitate this time. He took off, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. Jake stayed behind for a moment longer, making sure the gang was too disoriented to follow. He had done what he came here to do. Ethan was safe. Emma would be next. He took one last look at the gang, knowing they weren't finished with him. But Jake was done running. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he watched Ethan disappear into the shadows of the alley. The boy was running as fast as his legs could carry him, the weight of the past few hours heavy on his small shoulders. Jake knew he had to stay ahead of the game. The gang was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had them both. He wasn't about to let that happen. His mind raced, calculating the next move, but his body moved on its own, adrenaline driving him forward. He glanced over his shoulder one last time to make sure no one was following him. The gang had regrouped, but they weren't as organized as before. They were angry, but they were also off balance. Jake had seen enough battles to know that this was his opportunity. He ran after Ethan, keeping low and moving quickly through the alley. The noise from the motorcycles had faded, but Jake knew they would be back. They were relentless. As he turned the corner, he saw Ethan up ahead, standing by the entrance of a small building. The boy was waiting for him, looking over his shoulder nervously. "You good?" Jake asked, catching up to him. Ethan nodded, but the fear was still in his eyes. "We're almost there," Jake said, trying to offer some reassurance. But the truth was, they weren't out of the woods yet. They needed to get to Emma. That was the goal. That's what had kept him going through all of this. He wasn't about to stop until both of them were safe. Ethan stepped aside, letting Jake lead the way. They moved quickly through the narrow street, trying to blend into the shadows. Jake's mind kept going back to Emma. He had promised Ethan he would get him to her, and now, more than ever, he needed to keep that promise. They passed abandoned storefronts and dark alleys, staying out of sight as much as possible. The sound of the motorcycles never fully disappeared, but Jake knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The streets started to clear out as they moved deeper into the residential area. Jake's pulse quickened. They were close now. The house was just up ahead, and he could see the outline of the building through the gap in the alley. Ethan was still right behind him, but Jake could tell the boy was getting tired. He was holding it together, but the fear was still there, just below the surface. They reached the front of the house, and Jake stopped, looking around quickly. He could hear the faint rumble of engines in the distance. It wouldn't be long before the gang realized where they were. "Stay low," Jake said, pushing open the rusty gate and leading Ethan to the back of the house. The backyard was overgrown with weeds and vines, but it was quiet. The perfect place to lay low for a while. They slipped into the yard, moving as quietly as they could, and Jake's eyes darted around, checking every corner. He wasn't sure how much time they had, but he knew they couldn't afford to wait too long. Ethan was breathing heavily now, his small chest rising and falling with each labored breath. "Almost there, buddy," Jake said, offering him a small smile. The boy looked up at him, his face weary but determined. "Thanks for everything," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't respond at first. He was too focused on the sound of the engines growing louder. He knew it was time. He needed to move quickly. He led Ethan toward the back door, his hand on the boy's shoulder as they moved through the narrow corridor. They reached the door, but just as Jake reached for the handle, he heard it, the sound of a motorcycle screeching to a halt. His heart skipped a beat. The gang had found them. Stay here, Jake said, pushing Ethan toward a nearby closet. The boy's eyes widened in fear, but Jake held his gaze. I'll be right back. Just stay hidden. Ethan nodded, retreating into the closet as Jake turned toward the door. He could hear the gang outside, their voices growing louder as they circled the house. They were getting closer. Jake had no choice now but to face them head on. He wasn't going to let them hurt Ethan. He wasn't going to let them hurt anyone else. Taking a deep breath, Jake opened the door and stepped into the hallway. He moved silently, listening for any sounds of movement. He heard footsteps, heavy and slow, but he didn't wait. He moved toward the front of the house, his knife in his hand, ready for whatever came next. As he reached the front door, he saw them. 3 of the gang members, standing in the street, their motorcycles idling behind them. They hadn't seen him yet. Jake's heart raced as he crept closer, his knife held tightly in his hand. The tension in the air was thick. He knew he had one shot at this. Without warning, Jake lunged. He swung the knife at the closest man, knocking him off balance. The other 2 reacted quickly, but Jake was faster. He slammed his shoulder into one, knocking him to the ground, then turned to face the last rider. The man hesitated, eyes wide with shock, but Jake didn't give him a chance to recover. He rushed forward, disarming him with a quick strike before knocking him to the ground. Jake stood over them, his chest heaving. With exertion, he wasn't finished. Not yet. He turned and ran back to the closet, his mind focused on Ethan. The boy was waiting, his eyes wide with fear. Jake stopped in front of him, breathing heavily. Let's go, he said, his voice low. We're getting out of here. Together, they moved quickly, the sound of the motorcycles still ringing in the distance. Jake wasn't sure how long they had, but he knew it was time to get Ethan to Emma. They couldn't stay hidden forever, but they were one step closer to safety. Jake's heart pounded as he and Ethan made their way through the winding streets, the sound of their footsteps the only noise in the still night air. They had managed to outrun the gang for now, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they found them again. The city was a maze, and while they had covered some ground, there was still a long way to go before they reached safety. Jake glanced down at Ethan, who was walking beside him, still shaken but trying to keep up. The boy had proven more resilient than Jake had expected, but he could see the toll it was taking on him. The fear in Ethan's eyes hadn't completely gone away, but it had shifted. Now it was tempered with determination, the same resolve Jake had seen in himself countless times. We're almost there, Jake murmured, trying to offer the boy some comfort, though the words felt hollow. The truth was, he wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running. He had promised to protect Ethan, to get him to Emma, but he had no idea what kind of trouble they were walking into next. As they moved through a narrow alley, the distant sound of motorcycles reached Jake's ears, causing his pulse to spike. The gang wasn't far behind. Jake stopped and motioned for Ethan to do the same. They pressed their backs against the cold brick wall, listening intently. The noise of the engines grew louder, closer. It wasn't just one bike this time. It was a whole pack, likely searching the streets for them. Jake's hand instinctively went to his knife, the weight of it grounding him in the moment. Stay here, he whispered to Ethan. Stay hidden. Don't make a sound. Ethan nodded, his eyes wide as he pressed himself against the wall beside Jake. Jake took one last look at the boy before stepping out into the alleyway, his heart racing. The motorcycles were close now, their engines vibrating through the ground. Jake had to think fast. He had no intention of letting them get any closer. He had to draw them away, buy Ethan the time he needed to get to safety. Jake moved quickly, ducking behind a nearby dumpster to stay out of sight. He knew they'd be able to hear him if he wasn't careful. His breath was steady, his mind racing through the possibilities. The gang was still looking for them, but Jake had a plan. He would use the shadows, use the darkness of the alley to his advantage. The bikes came into view, their riders circling the area, their heads turning as they searched for any sign of movement. Jake could feel his muscles tensing, the anticipation building. He waited, listening to the sound of their engines as they revved in the distance. He could see the figures now, the familiar leather vests and patches that marked them as members of the gang. They were close. He couldn't stay hidden for much longer. Without warning, Jake darted into the street, making himself visible to the riders. They spotted him instantly. There he is, one of them shouted, pointing in his direction. Jake's heart raced as the riders gunned their engines and sped toward him. The wind whipped through his hair as he ran, making himself a moving target, hoping to draw them away from Ethan. He sprinted down the street, weaving between parked cars, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear the motorcycles closing in behind him, the sound of the engines growing louder with each passing second. He needed to get to the alley at the end of the block. If he could just make it there, he could double back and lose them in the maze of streets. His legs burned, but he pushed through the pain, his focus laser-sharp. He glanced over his shoulder, seeing the riders gaining on him, their faces twisted in anger. They were relentless, but Jake was faster. He reached the alley just as the riders closed in. He ducked behind a dumpster, his back pressed against the cold metal. He held his breath, waiting for the gang to pass. The sound of their motorcycles echoed off the walls of the narrow alley. It felt like hours, but Jake knew it was only a matter of seconds before they passed. He waited, listening to the sounds of the bikes fading into the distance. When he was sure they were gone, he stood up and peeked out from behind the dumpster. The alley was empty. He had done it. He had drawn them away, bought Ethan the time he needed. Jake took a deep breath and turned back to where he had left the boy. Ethan was still in the same spot, crouched low against the wall, his wide eyes scanning the street. As soon as he saw Jake, his face lit up with relief. "Are they gone?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. Jake nodded, his heart still racing. "For now, let's keep moving." They continued down the alley, their footsteps light but urgent. Jake's mind was still focused on the mission, getting Ethan to Emma. But the closer they got, the more he could feel the weight of what was ahead. They were almost there. Just a few more blocks, and they would reach the safe house. But Jake knew that the gang wouldn't stop. They had already made their move. Jake was ready to do whatever it took to keep Ethan safe. They moved quickly, turning a corner and disappearing into a small, quiet street. The houses here were older, the buildings closer together, creating a sense of privacy and protection. Jake glanced over at Ethan, who was still keeping up, despite the fear and exhaustion that was beginning to show in his face. They were almost there, and that gave Jake a sense of purpose. He had come too far to fail now. He wouldn't let anything stop him. Jake and Ethan moved quickly through the quiet street, the tension still hanging in the air like a thick fog. They had made it this far, but Jake knew better than to relax. The gang was still out there, and they were getting closer with every passing minute. He couldn't afford to be careless. His eyes flicked between the shadows, every alleyway a potential threat. The houses on this street were old, worn, their windows cracked and dusty, but they offered the cover they needed. He glanced over at Ethan, who was walking beside him, his small hand clutching the sleeve of Jake's jacket. The boy was still scared, but there was a fire in his eyes now, a determination to make it through this. Jake's heart tightened. He had promised to protect him, and he would keep that promise. They reached a corner and stopped, the sound of motorcycles still echoing in the distance. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had to keep moving, had to get them both to safety. The safe house was close now. Just a few more blocks, and they'd be there. Jake looked down at Ethan, the boy's face still pale, but set with resolve. "We're almost there," Jake said, his voice low. "Just keep going, all right?" Ethan nodded, though his eyes were wide with uncertainty. Jake squeezed his shoulder. "We're doing good. We're gonna make it." They continued down the street, keeping to the shadows, moving as quietly as possible. Jake kept his ears tuned to the sound of the engines. They were still coming, the low rumble of the bikes unmistakable. He knew they couldn't afford to be caught now. They had to make it to the house. As they turned the corner onto the next block, Jake saw it, the house. It was tucked away at the end of the street, surrounded by tall, overgrown hedges that offered a level of privacy. Jake's pulse quickened. They were close, but the gang was even closer. He could hear them revving their engines, their voices shouting as they searched the area. "We're not safe here," Jake said, his voice urgent. He grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him towards the gate at the side of the house. They slipped through it quickly, the sound of the motorcycles getting louder by the second. The house was quiet, but Jake knew they couldn't stay there for long. They had to get inside and lock the door before the gang found them. As they reached the back door, Jake pulled out his phone, sending a quick message to the person inside. The door was old, the wood creaking as Jake twisted the handle. It was unlocked. Jake pushed it open and ushered Ethan inside. The house was dark, the only light coming from the thin sliver of moonlight shining through the window. "Stay close," Jake whispered, closing the door behind them. He could hear the faint sound of the motorcycles in the distance, but they were still too far to catch them. For now, they were safe. They moved quietly through the house, Jake's eyes scanning each room as they passed. He knew they couldn't stay there forever, but for now, they had a moment of peace. Ethan looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and relief. "Are we safe?" he asked, his voice small. Jake nodded, though he knew the danger wasn't over yet. "For now," he said, his voice steady. "But we can't stay here long. We've got to keep moving." They reached the living room, where a man was waiting. Jake didn't recognize him at first, but the man's calm demeanor told Jake everything he needed to know. The man stood up as soon as he saw them, his eyes scanning Ethan for any signs of injury. "You made it," the man said, his voice low. "Is everything all right?" Jake didn't answer right away. He looked at Ethan, who was still clinging to his side, his small face still pale with fear. "We're all right," Jake said, finally. "But we need to move fast. The gang's not far behind." The man nodded, his expression serious. "We've got a plan, but we need to get to the safe house. It's not far, but we have to move quickly." Jake didn't hesitate. He turned to Ethan, his face softening for just a moment. "Stay close. I won't let anything happen to you." Ethan nodded, his trust in Jake unwavering. They moved toward the back door, the man leading the way. Jake kept an eye on the street outside, his senses on high alert. He couldn't shake the feeling that the gang was closing in. They had to move. Now, the man opened the door and motioned for them to follow. They slipped out into the night, the sound of the motorcycles still lingering in the air. Jake's pulse quickened again, but this time, he kept his focus on Ethan. They had one chance to get out of here. They had to make it count. As they walked quickly down the street, Jake could hear the faint sound of the gang's bikes getting closer. He knew they didn't have much time. The man led them through the shadows, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before. Jake's mind raced. They had to get to the safe house, but he wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running. The engines were getting closer. The sound of the bikes grew louder with every passing second. Jake's grip on Ethan's hand tightened. They couldn't afford to stop now. The safe house was close. They could make it, but not if they didn't hurry. The street was eerily quiet as Jake, Ethan, and the man made their way through the shadows. The sounds of the gang's motorcycles had faded, but Jake wasn't fooled. He could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. They were still close, still searching. His grip on Ethan's hand tightened as they moved through the dark, every step bringing them closer to safety, but also deeper into uncertainty. They rounded another corner, the man leading the way, his eyes scanning the streets. They were getting close to the safe house, but Jake knew it wouldn't be long before the gang found them again. He had to keep moving, keep his focus on getting Ethan to Emma. They had come so far, but they weren't there yet. "Stay sharp," Jake whispered to the boy, keeping his voice low. Ethan nodded, his small hand gripping Jake's sleeve as they walked. He was exhausted, but he kept going, his determination showing through the fear. They couldn't stop now. The man stopped suddenly, motioning for them to do the same. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he froze, his eyes darting around the darkened street. He could hear the faint sound of engines in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. The gang was coming. The man turned to them, his expression grim. "We need to make it to that building," he said, nodding toward a rundown structure a few hundred yards ahead. "It's the only place nearby where we can lay low for a while. But we have to move fast." Jake didn't hesitate. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He didn't have time to question the plan. He just had to trust that this man knew what he was doing. "Let's go," Jake said, pulling Ethan closer. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, their footsteps barely making a sound on the cracked pavement. The engines were getting louder, too close now. Jake's heart raced, every instinct telling him to run, to get as far away as possible, but he couldn't leave Ethan behind. Not after everything they had been through. As they reached the building, the man quickly moved to the door and pushed it open. They slipped inside, the cool air inside offering a moment of relief. But Jake knew it was only temporary. They had to keep moving, keep staying one step ahead of the gang. "We'll stay here for now," the man said, closing the door quietly behind them. "But it won't be long before they figure out where we went. We need to be ready to move again." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the dimly lit interior. The place was empty, a hollow shell of a building that had seen better days. Broken windows and crumbling walls told the story of a place long forgotten. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. Ethan was still gripping Jake's sleeve, his face pale and drawn. The boy was exhausted, and Jake knew he couldn't keep up this pace for much longer. "You okay?" Jake asked, his voice softening as he crouched down to the boy's level. Ethan looked up at him, his eyes tired but filled with determination. "I'm fine," he said, though the tremble in his voice gave him away. "We're almost there, right?" Jake's heart clenched at the question. He wanted to say yes, wanted to tell the boy that everything would be okay, but he couldn't make that promise. "Not yet. We're getting close," Jake said instead, keeping his voice steady. "Just hang in there." They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the distant hum of the motorcycles growing closer again. Jake kept his eyes on the door, waiting for any sign of the gang, but for now, they were safe. Ethan finally broke the silence. "Why are they after us?" His voice was small, filled with confusion. Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "They're after me," he said quietly. "Not you." Ethan frowned, his brow furrowing. "Why you?" Jake didn't know how to answer. He had his reasons, his past, but he wasn't about to drag the boy into it. "It's complicated," he said after a pause, "but I'll make sure they don't get you." The sound of the engines grew louder, too loud to ignore. Jake's heart raced again as he stood up, motioning for Ethan to do the same. They couldn't stay here much longer. The gang was closing in. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice urgent. The man nodded, his eyes scanning the room for any other exits. Jake could hear the motorcycles stopping outside, the riders getting off their bikes, their voices carrying through the walls. "We're running out of time," Jake muttered under his breath. The man moved to the back of the building, his hand reaching for the door. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we've got a few more minutes. Follow me." Jake and Ethan followed the man, moving quickly through the narrow hallway at the back of the building. The sound of the gang outside was getting closer, and Jake's pulse quickened. They had to keep moving. The man pushed open another door, leading them out into another alley. "We need to get to the next block," he said. "There's a car waiting for us there." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the alley as they moved. They were almost out of time, and every second counted. The motorcycles roared to life again, the gang starting their search once more. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as they pushed forward. They were almost there, just a little farther. The cold air was biting as Jake, Ethan, and the man moved quickly through the alley, the sound of motorcycles roaring in the distance. They had made it this far, but Jake knew they weren't safe yet. Every step they took, every turn they made brought them closer to the gang, and the closer they got, the more desperate the situation became. Ethan was walking close behind him, his hand gripping Jake's sleeve as they moved through the narrow passage. The boy had been silent for a while, but Jake could feel the fear radiating off of him. He wasn't sure how much more of this the kid could take. "We're almost there," Jake whispered, though the words felt empty. They had to get to Emma. He had promised Ethan he would protect him, and he wouldn't stop until both of them were safe. The man ahead of them stopped suddenly, glancing back. "We need to be careful," he said, his voice urgent. "The gang is closing in. We can't let them find us now." Jake nodded, his mind racing. They had to get to the car, but it wasn't going to be easy. He could hear the sound of the bikes getting louder. The gang wasn't far off. They had to move faster. "Stay close," Jake ordered, pulling Ethan a little closer. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, their footsteps barely audible on the cracked pavement. They had to be quiet. They had to stay under the radar. As they turned the corner, Jake saw the familiar shape of a car parked at the end of the street. His heart lifted slightly. They were close, so close. But as they moved toward it, the sound of engines roared again, and Jake's stomach dropped. They weren't alone anymore. He turned to the man, who was already motioning for them to move faster. "We need to hurry." "They're here," the man said. Jake felt the pressure building in his chest as they sprinted toward the car. They weren't going to make it if they didn't pick up the pace. The sound of the gang's motorcycles echoed through the streets, getting closer with every second. Jake's heart was pounding now, his mind filled with the one thought: get Ethan to safety. They reached the car just as the sound of engines grew deafening. Jake turned to Ethan, his face stern. "Get in the car. Now," he said, his voice low but firm. Ethan didn't hesitate, scrambling into the back seat. Jake followed, slamming the door behind him. The man was already in the driver's seat, his eyes scanning the street. "Hold on," the man muttered, his hands gripping the wheel as he started the car. The tires screeched as they pulled away, the car lurching forward. Jake looked out the back window, his eyes narrowing as he saw the headlights of the motorcycles closing in. They were in pursuit. But Jake wasn't about to let them catch them. "Speed up," Jake barked, his voice sharp. The man nodded, pushing the pedal to the floor. The car sped down the street, the tires screeching as they tore through the night. Jake glanced over his shoulder, watching as the motorcycles tried to catch up. They were close, too close for comfort. He could see the gang riders weaving through traffic, their engines roaring as they gained ground. Jake's pulse raced. He knew they couldn't outrun them forever. The man swerved the car to avoid a parked truck, but the motorcycles were still on their tail, gaining faster now. "We can't keep this up," the man said, his voice tense. "We need to lose them." Jake's mind raced. He knew they had to get off the main roads. "Take the next exit," Jake ordered. The man didn't question him, swerving hard to the right. The car shot off the main road, tires skidding as they hit the off-ramp. They were headed toward a more isolated area, but Jake didn't know if it would be enough to shake the gang. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. The sound of the motorcycles grew fainter as they sped down the new road, but Jake could still hear them, the engines roaring in the distance. "They're still behind us," Ethan said, his voice trembling. Jake turned to the boy, giving him a reassuring look. "We're not stopping," Jake said, his voice calm. Ethan nodded, though Jake could see the fear still in his eyes. They were almost there, but they weren't safe yet. The man kept his foot on the gas, the car picking up speed as they sped down the dark road. Jake kept looking behind them, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of the gang. They had to get to the next town, get out of the city before the gang caught up with them. "Almost there," the man said, his voice strained as he glanced at Jake. Jake nodded, his gaze still fixed on the road behind them. He wasn't going to let them down. They were getting out of this. They had to. But just as they rounded the corner, the sound of motorcycles roared again, much closer this time. Jake's stomach dropped. They had found them. The gang had tracked them down. Jake's mind raced. He had to make a decision. Fast. "Take the next left," Jake shouted. The man didn't hesitate, slamming the wheel to the left as they veered down another street. The car sped through the turn, but Jake could see the motorcycles gaining on them. It wouldn't be long before they were right on top of them. They needed to get off the road, fast. The car careened down the winding road, the headlights casting long shadows in the night as the roar of the motorcycles grew louder behind them. Jake could hear the sound of their engines, relentless and closing in. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct telling him to keep pushing forward to find a way out. He glanced over at Ethan, whose face was pale, his small hands gripping the seat as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. Jake's gaze flicked back to the rearview mirror. The gang was too close, and they were getting closer with every turn. The man driving the car glanced at Jake, his expression grim. "They're not giving up," he muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. "We've got to lose them." Jake's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. They couldn't outrun them forever, but they could try to shake them. They had to make it to the safe house, just a few more miles down the road. "Take the next left," Jake ordered, his voice firm. The man didn't hesitate, slamming the car into the turn. The tires screeched as they veered onto a narrow side street, the engine roaring as they pushed forward. But the motorcycles were right behind them, gaining ground with every passing second. Jake gritted his teeth. They were almost there. The safe house was just ahead. They had made it this far, but they weren't out of danger yet. The gang would stop at nothing to get to them, but Jake wasn't about to let them win. He would fight to protect Ethan, to protect Emma, to protect everyone who depended on him. He wasn't done yet. They reached the end of the side street and turned onto a dirt road, the tires kicking up gravel as the car bumped over the uneven surface. Jake could feel the car's suspension working overtime, but they were making good time. He looked out the window, seeing the lights of the safe house in the distance. They were so close now. He could almost taste the relief. But as they neared the entrance, the sound of the motorcycles roared again, closer than ever. Jake's stomach dropped. They had followed them. "We're almost there," Jake said, his voice strained. "Just a little farther." The man slammed the gas pedal, pushing the car harder, trying to outrun the gang one last time. But as they reached the gate of the safe house, Jake could hear the engines behind them, louder than ever. The gang was closing in. We need to get inside now. Jake barked. The man swerved the car into the driveway, tires screeching as they slid to a stop. The headlights blazed in the darkness, casting long shadows across the yard. Jake threw open the door, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him out. Go, 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 he shouted. They sprinted toward the door of the house, the sound of the motorcycles growing louder by the second. Jake didn't look back, but he could feel the heat of their pursuit. He had to make sure Ethan got inside. They reached the door, and Jake slammed it open. Inside, the people waiting for them quickly ushered Ethan in. Jake turned, facing the door as the sound of the motorcycles grew deafening. The gang had arrived. He could see their figures in the distance, the headlights blinding, the engines roaring like thunder. You need to go, the man at the door said urgently. We can't protect you if they find us here. Jake nodded, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't leaving anyone behind. He turned to Ethan, who was now safe inside the house. Stay here, lock the door, Jake instructed, his voice low. I'll handle this. Ethan looked terrified, but he nodded, understanding. Jake turned back toward the door, his hand tightening around the knife at his side. The gang was here. They were going to finish this one way or another, but Jake wasn't going down without a fight. The door rattled as the first rider slammed into it, the sound echoing through the house. Jake's heart raced, but he held his ground. This was it. He wasn't going to let them take Ethan, not after everything they had been through. He could hear their footsteps, their voices yelling as they prepared to break the door down. Jake took a deep breath, his muscles tense, ready for whatever came next. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't just protecting Ethan anymore. He was protecting everyone who depended on him, and he wasn't going to fail them. The door exploded inward, the gang rushing in. Jake didn't hesitate. He lunged at the first man, slamming his shoulder into him and sending him crashing into the wall. He barely had time to react before another gang member came at him with a crowbar. Jake dodged the swing, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting, forcing him to drop the weapon. He moved swiftly, knocking the man out with a single punch. But there were more of them. Jake turned just in time to block a punch from the third rider, barely managing to duck under the blow. He swung back, connecting with the man's jaw, sending him stumbling back. The fight was chaos, but Jake kept his focus. The gang wasn't going to take him down. Not today. He fought with everything he had, his every movement calculated, precise. One by one, the gang members fell. Finally, the last man standing backed away, his eyes wide with fear. You're finished, Jake growled. The man dropped his weapon and turned, running for the door. Jake watched him go, then turned to the safe house door. Ethan was inside, safe. Jake had done it. The fight was over. He had kept his promise. He had protected Ethan and Emma. They were safe now.